Mexico has voted and chosen who will be its new president for the next 6 years, the successor to the super popular Andrés Manuel López Obrador. For the first time in its history, the person who will take the reins of the country will be a woman, Claudia Sheinbaum. VisualPolitik community, we have no idea if Sheinbaum will keep the tradition of AMLO's Mañanera talks, his lengthy daily broadcasts. But what we do know is that with close to 60% of the vote, her presidency will get off to a great start. Sheinbaum has won in a landslide. She scored 30 points over her opponent. And so, the bloodiest and deadliest campaign of Mexican democracy is behind us. Now, those of you familiar with Mexico know all this very well, but I'm sure that for most of you, this name still doesn't mean much. That's why we're going to start this video at the very beginning. Although I can already tell you that Sheinbaum faces a colossal challenge to stop being AMLO's successor and become the president of Mexico in her own right. Sheinbaum is a scientist with more than 20 years of experience in politics. Without going any further, in 2018, she became the first woman to lead the government of Mexico City, the federal capital. Of course, her political career began much earlier, in 1989, in the leftist party of the Democratic Revolution. But it was in 2014 when she joined the National Regeneration Movement, Morena, AMLO's party. In her personal life, Sheinbaum is of Jewish descent, although, in truth, religion does not run in her family, because she does not practice Judaism. What does run in her family, however, is politics, because her father, Carlos Sheinbaum, was a militant of the Communist Party of Mexico. And that's not all. Sheinbaum is AMLO's choice, a sure bet. Plain and simple, his favorite to succeed him. In fact, many predict that the Sheinbaum administration will be a sort of AMLO 2.0, although it has been the president-elect herself who has made this very clear.
A man who has made history and is making history. May the people of Mexico know, may they know from here, dear President, that we will guard your legacy, that we will not betray. Long live President Andrés Manuel López Obrador.
And let's see, with the president's popularity skyrocketing, with more than 60% approval, it's understandable that the future president does not want to get off that boat. After all, who wouldn't take advantage of it? In fact, she has taken upon herself the challenge of continuing the so-called fourth transformation, if indeed this transformation ever began. We're talking about what has been, at least in political discourse, the cornerstone of AMLO's project, as we recently told you in another of the videos in this special series on Mexico. We're talking about a plan that had a series of key points that, to tell the truth, in some cases, seem as empty as they are utopian. To put an end to corruption and privileges, to reduce poverty, to create the conditions for people to live happily, to live in a better and fairer society, for the people to be free and democratic. Things like that, which, of course, sound great, but in the end, are very vague. Well, AMLO has managed to garner enough popularity for many Mexicans to really get excited about this project. Well, it is this transformative cause which promises more social justice, a relentless fight against corruption, and greater attention to indigenous peoples that has propelled Sheinbaum to power, just as it did with AMLO 6 years ago. Just a moment though, because that is just staying on the surface. The truth is that the new president also brings differences up her sleeve with respect to her predecessor. For example, unlike AMLO, this president-elect has her sights set on uniting the country in the fight against global warming. To this end, she wants to promote a huge energy transition plan side by side with the private sector, something AMLO does not agree with at all, neither in terms of the energy transition, much less in terms of private investors. It's not for nothing that his efforts in the last 6 years have been to close the door to the national energy sector.
In recent times, a current of opinion has emerged against oil and other fossil energies, which has led to plans to eliminate or reduce their use and to put into practice the production of clean and renewable energies. But we must calculate the timing of this energy transition well so that Mexico does not fall back into dependence on foreigners.
But okay, maybe with the amount of problems the country has, all this may seem to be nothing more than a very minor detail. Because as we've already told you here on VisualPolitik, Mexico is still dragging unbearable corruption. Security is still not improving. The power and activities of drug cartels are increasing, and the immigration problem has damaged its relations with the United States. And that's just the big issues. And yes, there are more, many more. And that is why in this video, we're going to look at the most important social challenges that the new president, Claudia Sheinbaum, will have to face. Challenges such as poverty, which after some improvement remains at terrible figures of 36% of the population. The serious problem the country has with education, or even the decrepit state of healthcare. And that's just to mention a few. Would you like to join us to learn about the Mexico that awaits the new president? Well, let's get started.
The big headache.
Let's get straight to the point. We all know that the main concern for Mexicans is the lack of security. At least that was the top response of 55% of Mexicans in a recent Ipsos survey. But do you know what comes next? Well, as expected, the economy. But take note, not the economy in general, but above all, the economy that affects families. According to the same survey, the next three concerns were unemployment, inflation, and poverty and inequality, in that order. And do you know what? It's no wonder. There are more than enough reasons. Of Mexico's 127 million inhabitants, 46 million live in poverty. Or put another way, Mexico alone has more poor people than Canada has inhabitants. That's crazy. And in regional terms, the data are not at all flattering either. Mexico has a higher percentage of poor people than countries such as Peru, and along with Colombia and Honduras, it leads the ranking of poverty among children under 18 years of age. And that's not all. Extreme poverty affects 7.1% of the population. That is, 9.1 million people in Mexico do not have enough to buy essential foods, do not eat at least 3 full meals per day, and do not have access to drinking water or medical services of a certain quality. It's a drama that, far from improving, has become even worse during AMLO's presidency. Because although overall poverty has been reduced by almost 7 points, according to the government's own figures, people who have entered into extreme poverty have grown by nearly 500,000 individuals during the last presidential term. López Obrador has focused more on combating poverty in general than on paying attention to the most severe poverty. What's more, the Mexican president has not been able to solve one of the major problems that generate poverty in the country: job insecurity. In Mexico, this problem is closely linked to informal work. And we're not talking about an isolated problem, but about the mother of all problems. More than half of Mexicans work under the table. And of course, we might think that such a left-wing president would be concerned first and foremost with bringing as many workers as possible into the formal sector, right? At the end of the day, we're not only talking about economic losses for the state, which receives less income from taxes, but also fewer labor guarantees, less security for workers, and a long list of other inconveniences. And pay attention, because we're talking about 25% of GDP being in irregular work. Well, it turns out that no progress has been made in this area either. AMLO took office in 2018 with an informal labor rate of 56.7%, and 6 years later, at the end of his term, it stands at 54%. In other words, it has hardly changed. The problem persists. It's up to us to continue searching for the great transformation. What's more, in Mexico, in order to earn a decent living wage, you have to work long hours, even in legitimate jobs. In fact, take a look at this chart. Of all OECD countries, Mexico has the second highest, behind only Colombia, number of hours worked per year. And I'm guessing this must have made your head explode for those of you who thought that countries like Japan or South Korea were the highest. However, that is the case, and it has a lot to do with what we're telling you. While 14 million Mexicans work more hours than they should in relation to their contract, the number of people who work and at the same time don't even have enough to eat properly has not fallen either. This is called in-work poverty.
In-work poverty in Mexico stagnates. 49 million people cannot afford to buy the basic food basket.
All of this has a very clear name: productivity problems, which AMLO, to tell you the truth, has not done much to improve. This will be one of the great challenges for the new president, because, as you can see, it is all very well to talk about rights, but without productivity, you have to work an enormous amount of hours. And on top of that, you still have a lot of in-work poverty. So, when we talk about productivity, it may sound like something boring and technical that only favors exploitative employers, but as you can see, this is not the case. The fact is that AMLO's government tried to counteract all this data by creating some new social plans and eliminating others that it considered ineffective or that caused corruption. The problem is that, once again, objectives are one thing and reality is quite another. The truth is that the results of their plan are almost non-existent. But the obvious question now is, what does the new president say about all this? Well, according to Sheinbaum, the goal during her term in office will be to lift 7.5 million people out of poverty. Now, how on earth does she intend to do that? Well, not surprisingly, following in the same footsteps as her mentor, creating new social programs. The options of trying something new like, I don't know, deregulating the economy, making it easier to convert informal jobs into regular ones, lowering taxes, or simplifying bureaucracy does not seem to be on the agenda. Instead, what awaits Mexico in the coming years is a string of new social rights, rights. The problem, or rather the question is, how is all this going to be financed? The president knows that money does not grow on trees, and that in order to finance an increase in social spending, estimated at 6% of GDP, she will need to get it from somewhere. Well, for the moment, there is no answer. It is simply not known. However, all indications are that she will have to do so with tax increases. Hopefully, not so much that it will slow down the huge wave of foreign investment that is entering the country to set up production centers to supply its northern neighbor, because that is Mexico's greatest hope and opportunity right now. In short, at least in the economic field, the great transformation has not arrived. And to tell you the truth, we don't know much about the new president's concrete plans either. Mexico needs to increase its productivity along with the country's legal and physical security. That would be the way to become a huge industrial power capable of supplying tons of products to the United States. Let's hope that the new government pays more attention to all these things than AMLO has. However, we would not be making a complete analysis of the social problems Sheinbaum will face if we didn't also talk about other important fields, such as education or health. And I'm telling you, these are a real disaster in Mexico. Listen up.
Rebuilding ruins.
VisualPolitik community, there are things in Mexico that work dismally. And among them, two of the things that most concern Mexicans are education and healthcare. Two fields that, to be honest, are typically a good indicator of how well or poorly a state is managed. Well, these are a real disaster in Mexico, and I'm not exaggerating. To give you an idea, 45% of Mexican students perform poorly in reading, double the OECD average. Exactly the same is true in mathematics. 56% underperform compared to the average of 24%. And in science, 47% of students perform poorly, compared to the OECD average of 22%. In other words, roughly half of all students do not reach a basic level of knowledge. And although it's true that in some areas, such as school dropout rates, the figures have improved somewhat, the data are still bad, very bad. There is a huge lack of investment here, and a good part of what there is lost to corruption, inefficient bureaucratic structures, and lack of control, something that gives rise to things like this.
Michoacan detects more than 1,000 teachers who do not go to work.
To make matters worse, many teachers in Mexico are not well trained, a problem that particularly affects rural and poorer areas. This is no small matter because it results in poor students receiving a poorer quality education than the rest. It's a vicious cycle. Receiving a low quality education makes it more difficult to attain a minimum acceptable education, and that in turn makes it harder to escape poverty. Mexico is also the country with the highest number of bullying cases in the world. The figures are shocking. It's part of the culture of violence that reigns in much of the country.
Bullying in Mexico reaches the highest number of cases worldwide. In Mexico, the situation is alarming. 7 out of every 10 children and adolescents suffer it.
It's truly outrageous. And not surprisingly, this also causes many to drop out of school and other students to have mediocre results. Now, these are just some of the problems with education in Mexico, but what about solutions? Well, AMLO's flagship policy has been aimed at trying to reduce school dropout rates.
Se inscriben en primero de prepa y, como aquí se ha dicho, si se inscriben 10, terminan 6. 4 se quedan en el camino. ¿Por qué razón? En la mayoría de los casos, porque no hay apoyo económico.
To this end, what he's done is to greatly expand scholarships. And so, during his presidency, the budget for school scholarships has increased by 43% in real terms. Now there are more scholarship students, but there is a peculiarity. Mexican government scholarships used to be part of social inclusion plans. That is, they used to be available only to those who really needed them. But with AMLO, these scholarships have become universal. And do you know what that means? Well, take a look. Today, 4 out of every 10 teenagers receive a government scholarship. And this is true at all income levels, almost equally. And this VisualPolitik community is a clear regressive measure. They are directing very scarce public resources to people who don't need these aids, while those who do need them would probably need more. And there simply aren't enough resources to do both at the same time. That is obvious. Even so, it must be said, the school dropout rate has been reduced during the López Obrador administration. But what is the next president's commitment to education? Well, Sheinbaum's star promise in education is to continue extending scholarships and to include university students as well. Even those who go to private universities, that is, those who likely come from middle and upper income families. Some analysts consider that this measure, rather than being aimed at solving problems, has sought to attract higher income voters to Morena. Something that, given the election results, what can I say, seems to have worked out pretty well for them. And if education is a pending subject, a headache, healthcare is a very similar story. In Mexico, apart from those who can afford private insurance, only part of the population has full access to healthcare. And during AMLO's administration, this has not improved either. Take a look.
From 2018 to 2022 in Mexico, the population with a lack of health services doubled, while the federal government ensures that at the end of this 6-year term, the quality of the health sector will be at the level of Scandinavian countries such as Denmark.
Good one, AMLO. On par with Denmark, no less. Anyway, jokes aside, we're talking about a real drama. According to Conival data, the population without access to health services increased from 16.2% in 2018 to 39.1% in 2022. Or, put another way, more than 30 million people were left without access to health services in the first 4 years of López Obrador's government. Today, around 50 million Mexicans have no real access to healthcare. We're talking about a problem that, apart from the havoc caused by corruption throughout the system, is also structural and has a lot to do with what we told you earlier, the high level of informal labor. Informal workers have no public social security coverage. Only those who can afford private insurance have access to healthcare. And this in a country where, as we have told you, millions and millions, tens of millions of Mexicans cannot even make enough to eat well, even if they are working, is a problem. Now, what did AMLO do to remedy this situation? He created a new health scheme in the country with the aim of universalizing healthcare. And so, in the midst of the pandemic, López Obrador decided to eliminate Seguro Popular, which had been in effect since 2003 and was a health insurance for people without social security. In its place, he created the Institute of Health and Well-Being, which lasted only 3 years and was later replaced by IMSS Bienestar. In summary, the main differences between Seguro Popular and the current IMSS Bienestar is that the current service is financed entirely with federal funds. There are no longer small family contributions, and it is more oriented to rural communities and less to urban areas. True, it is still too early to say which of the two models work best, but in both cases, the problems are clear: lack of capacity and lack of funding. It's one thing to say what you would like to do, and another what can actually be done, and AMLO has not taken that into account. The process of changing the model and the lack of resources has meant that today there are even more people without healthcare coverage in the country than before. And that is not to say that those who are covered don't still face chronic problems, such as shortage of doctors, endless waiting lists, and a lack of medicines. On top of that, nowhere near enough healthcare infrastructure is being created to bring as many people into the system as is being claimed. And this is something that is clearly seen if we compare what is invested in each healthcare subsystem of the country. With this graph, you will see it very clearly. What you are looking at is the per capita healthcare expenditure in 2024. As you can see, the best off are those who work for Pemex, the Mexican oil company. Then come the civil servants, then Social Security, which is what the ordinary formal worker has. And finally, with a little more than 4,000 Mexican pesos a year, that's barely $235, the Universal Health Service. And of course, with little more than $19 a month, you can understand that the healthcare you will receive will be very poor. AMLO's government and soon Sheinbaum's government wants to provide public healthcare to many more people via IMSS Bienestar. The problem, as you can see, is that to do it well, they need resources that Mexico does not have right now. Do you now understand why economic growth and productivity are so important? Well, there you have it. Even so, all these changes, although feeble, have been well received by Mexicans. 7 out of 10 Mexicans are satisfied with the progress of public education, while 6 out of 10 are satisfied with IMSS Bienestar, that is, the non-contributory healthcare system. Many may think that the results of these policies will take time to be seen because they are not yet well established, but it will take a long time and a lot of money for this to work, and it is not clear that either will be forthcoming, not even during Sheinbaum's presidency. In any case, if there is one thing we can say, it's that with AMLO, and now with the next president, Mexico has entered a much more welfareist stage. The state is much more present than before in terms of social policies, and that contrasts with the cuts in structures that AMLO has made. The question is, will the rampant corruption allow a certain welfare state to exist in Mexico, or will the resources end up being stolen by politicians and various officials? Well, only time will tell. Now it's up to Claudia Sheinbaum to prove that Morena is not as corrupt as the other major Mexican political parties, the PRI or the PAN. Here on VisualPolitik, we will be very attentive to everything that happens in Mexico, but now, at this point, it's your turn. Do you think AMLO has made the right moves in the fight against poverty, or could different things have been done? Do you think Mexico has better education and healthcare today than than it did 6 years ago. What do you expect from the next president, Claudia Sheinbaum? Well, leave your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. And very importantly, if you liked this video, hit the like button and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thank you so very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.